Morning, and many thanks to all for joining this morning's briefing on the provisional national accounts and international accounts results for Q4 2022 and preliminary results for the year 2022 as well. We'll have time today for questions at the end of the presentations, and can I ask people to use the chat function for questions or raise their hands if they would like to come off mute to ask a question. Today's results are showing growth in GDP in the year 2022, with the provisional results for Q4 2022 also showing growth in the quarter. This morning's briefing will take us through the detail and the breakdowns to help us to see the M&E activity and the underlying domestic activity that's driving this growth in the economy. As always, at this point or this stage of the year, we say the results are preliminary for 2022, and the annual national accounts results due mid-year will give a more definitive and more detailed picture for the year 2022. We'd like to take the opportunity today also to introduce our work on experimental early estimates for GDP or flash estimates. Also today, we continue to roll out new information related to our compensation of employees. We have constant price COE or compensation of employee data included in today's quarterly national accounts. So as always, the slides from the briefing will be available along with the statistical publications on CSO's website. And we hope to make a recording of today's presentations available on the CSO YouTube channel. Contact details are available on the publications and on the press release, so please contact us today or at any stage with queries you may have. So I'll pass to Chris and John now to take us through the Q4 results, and then Brian will take us through a quick introduction to the work on the flash GDP estimation. So pass to Chris. Many thanks.
Thanks, Jennifer. So I have the results for you for Q4 2022. I'll go into those, but first I'll deal with the annual outturn. So with a set of detailed accounts for you today, we can confirm that the GDP outturn at this stage is 12% for the year. But with a detailed set of results today, we can tell you the result for modified domestic demand for the year has come out quite strongly at 8.2% as well. The big driving factor in MDD is, of course, the equipment, machinery and equipment spending we've been seeing throughout the quarters. We discussed this at the last number of briefings. A little weaker in Q4, and hence the results on an MDD for the quarter. But for the year, a very strong result on spending, on back to office spending by lots of businesses, and spending on data centres by some of the M&Es as well. So a very strong result in investment and MDD for the year. If we look at then the first view of 2022 and current prices, used as a lot by a lot of people as a denominator for different amounts in spending, GDP has just gone over 500 billion, 502 billion for the year. Our GNI star measure will be available at mid-year, and we can look at the modified version of that at that stage. But looking at the GDP number across a set of available European countries at this stage, we're out on the far right at 12% for the year, with the next countries nearly just over half that, just over 6% for Malta, Portugal, Croatia, with a fall at the far side for Estonia. If we look across the two methods then, firstly the output method of GDP, looking across sectors of the economy and how they perform, familiar pattern here of strong growth for the year in the industry sectors and in the information and communication sectors. Looking across the domestic data, the bellwether for us there, domestic distribution, transport, hotels and restaurants up 11.6%. And that's a theme you'll see throughout the series and the series of slides. You'll see that in wages data, in terms of consumption data, and here in the value-added data. That's a very strong result for that sector for the year. If I look, as I do each quarter, my favourite sectors here in terms of looking at the domestic and the M&E side of the economy, we see construction and distribution, transport, hotels and restaurants. The picture there, construction up on 2016, on that index to 2016, but very much lower growth in the two big M&E sectors, with this continued growth across a number of years in ICT and in industry. When we weigh up all the data and we look at across all the sectors by activity, so agriculture, industry, construction and services, and weigh them all up into M&E dominated sectors, we get a result of nearly 20% at 19.4%. But then the domestic facing sectors, strong growth there too at 7.2%. A new item we have today, we've been adding more and more features in terms of the wage bill or compensation of employees each quarter. We've had this in money amounts for a number of quarters. Then we produced a breakdown by M&E data and non-M&E data showing you that just over a third of the wage bill is by foreign-owned firms. And today we've put the wage bill into constant price data. So you can look at the results there, 7.8% result as real COE or the real wage bill increase for the year. And you can compare that then to PCE, MDD and real GDP. So it's putting it on a comparable basis. And for example, you see that the big domestic sector there, distribution, transport, hotels and restaurants, then in real terms, the wage bill there is up 12.5%, a strong result for 2022. On the expenditure side of the accounts, again, we build up expenditure from consumption, government spending, investment and net exports. That gets us up to GDP. The modified measure, the light blue line in the middle there, modified domestic demand, is the consumption element, the government spending, and then modified investment. It's that modified investment number that's perhaps interesting. A very strong outcome, nearly 20% increase in modified investment for the year. That's what was driving the MDD result. The elements within the expenditure method, consumption, what we all spend on goods and services, up 6.6% in the year. We've seen this pattern throughout the quarters, that it's not so much goods and cars, the spending on cars has been holding back the goods data throughout the quarters of the year, but it's the return to services, the increase in foreign travel and the return to public transport. That's really what's driving the consumption data in 2022. Giving us a strong kind of domestic result of 6.6% for the year. On the investment data, the takeaway here is this modified cap form is up nearly 20%, 19.8%. But within the cap form data, the dwellings data is showing us a very strong result, up considerably in 2022 over 21. But the other forms of building and construction, commercial and infrastructure, it has a much weaker result. So that's a notable feature to keep an eye on as we look through the data. The time series on that, I guess, adds the caution about the yellow piece there, the IP data and how we look at capital formation. And then the final building block on the expenditure side, net exports. We've seen strong growth there in goods exports and service imports, with net exports for us there, the line going from year to year, going up from 176 to 187 billion. But I'll leave exports to John to explain to you in the international accounts. So that's all the elements of the expenditure side. When we proportion out the MDD, modified domestic demand, and the net export side, we can see that most of the growth at GDP for 2022 is coming from the net export side, the M&E side of the economy. Taking the resulting profits from those M&Es out, that's about 131, just over nearly 132 billion of profits out of the economy. It takes us down to GNP, the GNP result of 6.7% growth. So weighing all that up, the first look we can get at 2022 and try to interpret what happened in 2022 over 2021. We see a strong GDP result of 12%. I'll just point at some of the elements on this one. A strong GDP result of 12%, but lots of domestic growth there too. So we look across the sectors and we see, yes, there's very strong growth for M&E sectors, but the domestic or non-M&E dominated sectors is up 7.2%. That's on the output side. We look at the expenditure spent in the economy. We see a strong result for consumption. PCE is up 6.6%. Government expenditure is a little more muted, but remember that's after a very strong result in 2021, with the supports in that year. Investment, modified investment is up strongly at 19.8%. This expenditure, as I said, on the kind of back to work equipment or back to office equipment rather, and on data centres, which has given us this modified domestic demand result of 8.2%. All of this fits, I think, pretty well with the new data we have for you today on wages and the wage bill, compensation of employees up 7.8%. So that's the annual picture, the first chance we've had to look at a detailed set of accounts for the year 2022. The quarter turned out to be a little softer than we first expected. The GDP result is 0.3%, down from the 3.5% we had in our preliminary estimate that Brian's going to talk to you a little bit about. But it's a familiar picture here. The MNEs were strong in the quarter, with some weakness in the construction sector and professional admin and support services. On the expenditure side of the accounts, we've got consumption up 1.1%, government expenditure up 2.5%. And when we net out the issues around IP with investment and for imports, we can see the modified investment number over here is minus 9.8%. That decline in modified investment is what gives us the MGD result in the quarter of minus 1.3%. Or to show you that across time, you can see the GDP result remaining positive, but you've got 2 quarters there of negative modified domestic demand. Why they've fallen in 2 quarters is the same reason. We had very strong equipment spending, machinery equipment spending in Q2 2022. So a fall on that into Q3 and again now into Q4 gives you that overall result of 2 negative quarters of MDT. Where are we in terms of GDP from available peers? Just a look at the European database today, and we're on the right-hand side in the middle of the table there with Malta, Romania, Cyprus with much stronger growth in the quarter, while you see falls on the other side in Lithuania and Sweden, Germany. Looking through the 2 sides again, so a familiar picture with industry and ICT, as we saw in the infographic. There's a little bit more detail here on some of the falls in other sectors, particularly like real estate, the construction, agriculture, forestry and fishing. Some falls in some more of the domestic sectors in the fourth quarter. Similarly, we can look at those across time. On the website, you can select the series you're interested in and again look at the 2 big M&E sectors and the continued growth there. I think the new information in Q4 there is the recovery in the ICT sector in Q4. We saw a little bit of a fall in that in Q3. So weighing up all the sectors into M&E and non-M&E sectors, we see that for Q4, it's strongly M&E sectors growing, the economy growing by, this is 10.2%, and the 0.1, positive, but 0.1% for the domestic sectors. Our new constant price wage bill data here shows us that in the quarter, the wage bill rose by 0.9%. We can look across the sectors on that. So again, we have distribution, transport, hotels and restaurants. This big domestic sector with strong growth in the quarter of 6.2%, while we see some falls in some of the others in construction, arts and entertainment, and even the biggest one there that we presented, the public, main education and health, the public sector falls there. This is in current prices, but the shares on this are important. So the share of the wage bill for M&Es or the foreign sector versus domestic, this remains at 34%. So the proportion of the wage bill paid by foreign firms versus domestic remains at 34 to 66%. Then on the expenditure side of the accounts, again, we can build up to GDP and we can build up to modified domestic demand. The domestic demand story is interesting here. So we take away the foreign elements, how we see the blue line, and how we build up to modified domestic demand consumption by individuals, by government, and modified investment. Or I filter it down again and just show you the modified investment data. This is largely the answer to most of the questions about what's gone on in Q4. If you look at the hatched orange area there, that's 13.7 billion in Q2 2022. So again, back to office expenditure, data centres, that peaked in Q2, and that's fallen off in Q3 and Q4. That's where a lot of our results today are coming from. But if you do look at that Q4 number, it's still higher than all the other values in 2021 and 2019 and 2018. So I think the result for the year is strong investment in machinery and equipment. It's down a little bit in the last 2 quarters, but I think that gives you a much kind of clearer picture of what's going on there. The elements, or the other elements rather, of the expenditure side. So personal consumption is positive. So despite all the price pressures, the high inflation you see, for example, on the consumer price index around consumption. So after prices are taken into account, we still have positive consumption of 1.1%, again, driven by services. That's just the chart I keep putting up to show you. I guess we have to keep spending the amount in money terms, the blue line, in order to get the volume amount, the green line. So we're presenting the number here at the 1.1% change in the green line there in volume terms that we all consume on goods and services. But the cost of that is going up, and that's worth keeping in mind throughout the set of, we look at the set of national accounts data. Putting that household consumption into European context, this green bar should be just sorted slightly different just over here, but so it still puts us on the right-hand side of the chart in terms of European countries, with stronger growth marginally in Belgium and definitely in Latvia, but falls in household consumption in a lot of other European countries in the quarter. To explain our consumption data, you can look at the high frequency series and the CSO, the retail sales index, largely explain, the goods side of it more, but you have that mixed picture overall, but a changing pattern across the different product, composition inside the retail sales index, the basket of items there. Turning to investment, if I could pick items out of this for you to say what's interesting in the investment data. It's this item here, machinery and equipment, excluding aircraft leasing, down 17.1% as quarter on quarter. That's the thing I've been telling you about, the back to office equipment and data centers. We can show you a little bit more detail when it's year on year. So this quarter on the same quarter last year, but a seasonal adjustment. And the one thing I'd pick out of that is the divergent pattern on the dwellings data. So dwellings are up quite strongly with the other building and construction. Is not, it's down year on year. And again, over time, the cautionary note around IP and how we look at the investment data. The final building block, again, on the expenditure side is net exports. And the notable feature here is probably the decline in service imports in the fourth quarter. But again, John has a lot more data on this and he can explain this one to you in a lot more detail. Again, showing you the contributions from the domestic demand side of the economy and the foreign demand side of the economy. They're weighing up a little bit more evenly in terms of the contributions to GDP in the quarter. And then removing M&E profits at 33 billion gives us a GNP growth rate of 4.7%. So I mentioned the deflator on PCE, and I think it's again worth just showing you some numbers on that just to bring that point home. On the consumption on the right-hand side there, this quarter compared to the same quarter last year, we can look at annual rates of change here, that we spent 11.7% more on goods and services. But because prices, the deflator here has gone up 6.9%, we're getting a volume increase year on year, 4.5%. And we can do the same thing. It's easier to understand with consumption, but we can do exactly the same thing with GDP. GDP's gone up in money terms by 19.4%. We're taking out price effects. It leaves us that headline GDP growth rate of 12% that we started the presentation with. So I guess prices are important in terms of our interpretation of the national accounts. So the final slide for me is to do the same thing again as I perhaps did with the annual, showing you how all this data stitches together. With a slightly weaker result than anticipated for GDP of 0.3%. But looking at all the domestic data within the output side on the left here and the expenditure side on the right, we can look at the growth in the M&E data. There's some falls in the domestic data in construction, a moderate growth in the big domestic sector, distribution, transport, hotels and restaurants. Weighing that construction and distribution, hotels, transport and restaurants together, we get the non-M&E data of 0.1 So it's marginal growth on the output side for the domestic sectors at 0.1. But on the expenditure side, we see consumption growing by 1.1, government expenditures up. Modified investment is the story I've been telling you throughout the set of slides, down minus 9.8. So combining that modified investment with the consumption and government expenditure gives us the MDD result, modified domestic demand, down 1.3. The new COE data is in there too, with 0.9% growth. So a lot of the domestic indicators is giving us a small positive growth, but the MDD is being brought down by the investment data. So that's the summary I have for you today. So I'll pass over to John for the international accounts.
Thank you, Chris. So now I'd like to take you through the international accounts for Q4 2022. So first we can see our infographic, which gives a really good summary of the results. We have our goods exports of 95 billion euros and our goods imports of 41 billion euros, combining to give us our net merchandise balance of 54 billion. Our services exports are 92 billion and services imports are 98 billion, giving us our services balance of minus 6.7 billion. Our income inflows are 47 billion and our income outflows are 79 billion, giving us our net income outflows of 31.4 billion. And these all combine to give us a current account balance of 15.8 billion or 12.2% of GDP. Our net international investment position at the end of the quarter was minus 607 billion euros, and our stock of foreign direct investments in Ireland stood at 1.3 trillion euros at the end of the quarter. Looking first at our preliminary results for 2022, we can see a merchandise surplus of 204.4 billion for the year, which is up 37.1 billion on the previous year. Our services balance is minus 16.8 billion, which is down 17.3 billion on the previous year. But this is largely driven by differences in IP imports between the 2 years. And our net income outflows are 143.4 billion, which are increased by 36.1 billion on last year. And these all combine to give us our current account balance for 22 of 44.2 billion, which is down 16.4 billion on last year. Moving to the quarter, we see here our headline figure, which is the current account balance as a percentage of GDP. With reduced IP imports again this quarter, we can see a return to levels similar to Q1 and Q2 of this year. And so we have our current account balance of 15.8 billion euros or 12.2% of GDP. Looking at how that breaks out, we have a merchandise surplus of 54 billion euros, which is up 13.7 on the same quarter last year. And we have a services balance of minus 6.7 billion euros, which is up 8.6 billion on the same quarter last year. And again, this is largely driven by differences in IP between the 2 quarters. Our income outflows are 31.5 billion, which is up 11 billion on the same quarter last year. And these all combine to give us a current account balance of 15.8 billion, which is up 11.2 billion on the same quarter last year. Looking at this breakout over time, we can see the quarters with the large negative services balances in Q4 20, Q4 21 and last quarter, signifying the large IP imports. And without large IP imports this quarter, we've returned to a positive current account balance. Comparing this quarter to last quarter, we can see our merchandise balance is up by 419 million euros. Our services balance is up by 11.8 billion euros. And our net income outflows have reduced by 8.1 billion euros. And these combine to give us a current account balance that's up 20.3 billion euros on last quarter. Looking at the exports and imports for these items, we can see our merchandise exports of 94.8 billion euros in the quarter, which is up 22.4 on the same quarter last year. And merchandise imports of 40.8 billion, which are up 8.8 billion on last year. And these combine to give our increase in net exports of 13.7 billion. Our services exports are 91.7 billion, which is up 6.3 billion on last year. And our imports are 98.4 billion, down 2.2 billion on last year. And these combine to give us the change in our net services of 8.6 billion. And our primary income inflows are 45.6 billion, which are up 11.7 on the same quarter last year. And our outflows are 75.7, up 22.8 on the same quarter last year. And these combine to give us our change in net income outflow of 11 billion. And within these, our direct investment profit and interest inflows have increased by 816 million and outflows by 10.3, with the remainder of the change it being in portfolio investment changes and other investment changes. Looking at our goods exports and imports a little more closely, on the export side, we can see the continued growth in exports over the last few quarters, with Q4 goods exports up compared to last quarter and up strongly compared to last year, while the goods imports are also up compared to last quarter and up compared to last year. But while both are increasing, the increase in exports is much stronger, and this is driving the increase in net exports. Looking at how this breaks out into international trade, goods for processing and other, we can see our international trade exports are down 4.6 billion on last quarter, but up 6 billion on the same quarter last year, while our goods for processing exports are up 6.2 billion on last quarter and up strongly by 14.1 billion on the same quarter last year. Merchanting, which is a net export, is up 1.9 billion on last quarter and 207 million on last year. On the import side, our international trade is down 270 million compared to last quarter, but up 6 billion compared to last year. And our goods for processing imports are up 3.1 billion on last quarter and 3.2 on last year. So again, we can see that the increase in net exports is being driven by the increase in exports, with this split between international trade and goods for processing. Looking at our service exports compared to last year, we can see an overall increase of 6.3 billion. And within this, computer services have increased by 2.4 billion and business services have increased by 2.3 billion, with operational leasing exports increasing by 228 million. Tourism services have increased by 1 billion and transport services have increased by 835 million, showing the continued recovery in these sectors. Looking at our imports, again, compared to last year, we see an overall decrease of 2.2 billion. But within that, we have a decrease in business services of 11.3 billion euros, and 10.5 billion euros of that is a decrease in R&D. Royalties have increased by 5.2 billion euros, and tourism services have increased by 1.5 billion euros, again showing the continued recovery in this sector. Looking at the royalty imports a bit more closely, in this graph we can see the blue line gives us the total royalty imports, while the green bar gives us the amount of royalty imports related to the pharma sector. And most of the difference between the two is related to the ICT sector. So for pharma, we can see an increase of 6.8 billion compared to last quarter and 4.5 billion compared to last year. And overall, we can see an increase of 11.9 billion compared to last quarter and 5.2 billion compared to last year. So we can see that there are increases in the pharma and non-pharma royalty imports, both compared to last quarter and last year. Looking at direct investment income, we have inflows of 14.3 billion, which are up 1.9 billion on the same quarter last year, and outflows of 41.3 billion, up 12 billion on last year. And these combine to give us an increase in net direct investment income outflow of 10.1 billion compared to last year. Looking at quarter on quarter, we can see inflows are up 8.6 billion and outflows are down 314 million. And these combine to give us a decrease in net direct investment income outflows of 8.9 billion compared to last quarter. Looking at how these outflows break down, we can see that income on debt is fairly flat as usual. We can see an increase in dividends in Q4 compared to Q3, but with a small decrease in the overall direct investment outflows, this results in a much smaller reinvested earnings this quarter. Looking at how these profit outflows break down by sector, we can see that there's a decrease in the manufacturing sector compared to last quarter of 4.8 billion and an increase in the information and communication sector of 4.1 billion since last quarter. And these almost balanced gives the overall outflow down 314 million. While if we look at this quarter compared to the same quarter last year, we can see an increase in the manufacturing sector, which is up 6.6 billion, and an increase in the information and communication sector, which is up 3.9 billion. Looking at our current account with the UK, the trade balance with the UK has decreased by 2.2 billion euros, and net income outflows have increased by 2.7 billion compared with the fourth quarter of 21. And the result is a current account deficit of 3.3 billion in the fourth quarter of 22, down 4.8 billion from the surplus of 1.6 in the fourth quarter of 21. Looking at our financial accounts, we can see relatively large net transactions in the different functional categories this quarter, with net direct investment increasing by 18.5 billion, net portfolio investment decreasing by 20.7 billion, and net other investment increasing by 26 billion. And looking at our net international investment position at the end of quarter four, it stands at minus 607 billion euros, which is an increase of 98 billion on the end of September position. And this increase is caused by several factors, including some corporate restructuring, exchange rate changes, and other routine changes in the quarter. And the change is predominantly driven by changes in non-financial corporations and other financial intermediaries. So to summarise, in Q4 22, we have a current account balance of 15.8 billion euros, or 12.2% of GDP. We see continued growth in goods and services exports, and we continue to see the COVID effects lessening, with tourism and transport exports and imports coming back to more usual levels. So now I'd like to pass over to Brian to take us through the preliminary GDP results.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. Just a chance for us to just talk a little bit about the new release that we released in January. It's a preliminary GDP estimate, T plus 30 days. So it's a new frontier release that we've just started to look at. So just to give some context to it, it's the Eurostat, the agency that does the statistical information for the European Community, has been producing a T plus 30 GDP flash estimate since April 2016. It's part of the objectives of the Economic and Monetary Action Plan, to get the timely statistics out there on GDP, which is the measure that's comparative across European member states. Just the infographic just shows you the type of thing that's produced. So there's a link there if you want to go on to the release that was released just recently in January. It's normally a GDP growth rate, seasonally adjusted, quarter-on-quarter change, and also a year-on-year change based on the seasonally adjusted data. So I'd say there's probably about 17 member states that produce their own flash estimates. There's a couple of countries that still don't produce it. We were one up to recently, so we started to look at this early estimate. I think most of the countries produce their own flash estimate as well, just nationally, like we do. I think that's okay, and it fits in with the ESA framework and so on. It's comparable with the other measures that we have in the Q&A that we're talking about here today. So just to talk a little bit about how we do it, it's preliminary estimate. It's 30 days after the end of the quarter, so there's less data. There's less data than we would have today at the T plus 60 estimate. Primarily, we base it on the output approach, whereas the T plus 60 would be a bit more complete. It would have both the output and the expenditure method. So also less detail at T plus 30. There's obviously more detail at the T plus 60 estimate, so it's an early estimate. And something, as I say, we're developing, and in time we'd hope to have more information on the expenditure side in the T plus 30 estimate. And it's based on as much information as we can get after the 30 days. So, there's information there on our short-term indicators from the office and our large cases unit as well. So just to give you some comparisons of how we've been getting on. The T plus 30, as I say, that we would have released and sent to Eurostat in January was 12.2% year on year. So that's 22 over 21. The T plus 60 today is 12%. The next row there compares an estimate that we would have done back in October, which we didn't release nationally, but we did send to Eurostat, and we have been talking to our colleagues in Eurostat. That was 3.7% versus 2.3%, which would have been the T plus 60 back in December. Then the Q4 2020, so the latest quarter versus the Q3, we would have predicted 3.5%. That's come down to 0.3%. So there's a bit of a drop there, and it's primarily due to information coming in on the expenditure side that we would not have had at the time. Q4 then, the Q4 22 over to Q4 21, which is the non-seasonally adjusted estimate. That's 13.5%. We would have come out with back in January, and that's now 12%. So that just to give you a feel for some of the comparisons there on the T+60. As I say, we're developing our methodology. You know, we've more work to do on it. I think it's been a good exercise for us, and we'll continue to develop the methodology. I think that's fine, Jennifer.
Thanks, William. That's good to take that. Great. Look, as people are developing their questions and finalising any questions they may have on the results here today, because I'm conscious we had a lot of information, annual, quarterly, and then some of the developmental work we're doing. I might just remind us of the headline results across the different outputs. So for the year 22 and 2021, we have GDP, and whole of economy indicator, that takes in all economic activity increasing by 12% in the year, driven by strong growth, 19% growth in the MME-dominated sectors, but also just over 7% growth in the domestic sectors as well. Modified domestic demand, as we always say, we drill down into the economy, that this modified indicator is very helpful to give insight on that domestic activity because it excludes the impact of aircraft leasing, intellectual property, product imports, and we're seeing 8.2% growth there in 2022 for modified domestic demand. PCE, the indicator of spending, government, personal and investment spending, increase of 6.6% there in 2022, bringing us almost back to levels of PCE or personal expenditure that we saw in 2019 before the COVID-19 pandemic. And then the new information today, the constant price compensation of employees, or that wage bill, to use maybe a more accessible expression for it, up 7.8% in 2022. And just to go quickly through to remind us of the quarter four results, seasonally adjusted GDP increase of 0.3% in quarter four on quarter 3 2022, and Brian has described as well the work on the flash estimates and the difference there between the initial estimates and our T plus 2 month or T plus 60 day estimates for GDP. And I think if we look at modified domestic demand and the contraction there of minus 1.3%, that helps us to understand what's happening in Q4 and why there was that turn between the T plus 30 estimates and the T plus 60 estimates. We are seeing, as we have there, the increased PCE or personal consumption of 1.1%, and government spending was up by over 2% in the quarter as well. But we had that softening on domestic investment on the machinery and equipment, and I think Chris drew that out very well in the results and the Q&A, and that impacted then into the estimation process for GDP at T plus 30. So just to repeat it there, personal consumption spending up 1.1% in the quarter, and then the compensation of employees, that new indicator there at constant prices, up 0.9% in the quarter. Okay, so many thanks to all the presenters, and I just want to check in to see if we have questions. We have some colleagues in the room today as well, so I might just check with the colleagues in the room, and then I can be going through the chat here to pick out the questions online. So Robert Short, RT. Many thanks, Robert.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the presentation. I was just wondering if you just go over again the reasons for the disparity between the flash estimate for Q4 GDP and the outcome, and whether or not that's the same explanation in part for the negative figure for modified domestic demand, and is that also the explanation behind the negative figure for modified domestic demand in Q3, and does consumption have a role to play as well?
Okay, many thanks, Robert. Just for, in case people didn't pick it up who might be listening online, the question was around the T plus 30 versus T plus 60 estimates for GDP and the role of what happened in modified domestic demand around that domestic investment and how that's been impacting the two sets of results. So it's a kind of a compound. So I might go to Chris first and then to Brian on that, because Chris can help with the report here, and then Brian can see how that did or didn't feed into the T plus 30. Many thanks.
Yeah, I guess working backwards in the set of questions, it's the same result for Q3 as Q4 it is. So it's the really high investment that we saw throughout 2022 on equipment. Peaked in Q2. There's a fall of that into Q3 and into Q4, and that's giving you the MTD result in Q3 and Q4. So the driving factor that, and it's not consumption. I think that's the second half, and then I don't know if it's your questions, but yeah, it's the MTD and the effect on expenditure. If you want to talk about the difference,
the flash estimate currently is predominantly uses the output measure. So it's the piece there on the expenditure that came in Q4. It was that lack of intellectual property products coming in Q4 that had a big impact on the expenditure side. I think that's what's played into the downward revision. And that's something we're going to be looking at. Trying to get more information on the expenditures into our flash estimate. Our early indications were that the output measure was a good indicator, and our testing did show that it gave a good predictor of the growth in the past quarters. This particular quarter was a challenge.
Thanks. Yeah, all right, yeah, from Reuters, yeah.
Just ask some on the consumption figures. Are they showing us that the consumer was actually pretty resilient in the last couple of quarters of last year, particularly given where inflation was and I guess how much more they'd spend to buy more goods and services?
Yeah, there's a number of ways you can interpret it. That to consume the same amount, to maintain consumption, of people are spending more, to keep their level of the volume of their consumption stable. And say in the fourth quarter, that just over 1% result for that. For the year, the over 6% result for consumption there. It's probably something more to that. The increase in foreign travel we saw going on throughout the summer in particular, I guess, the impact of that, and more use of public transport. There are two driving factors there. So you have the two things. One, people are spending more just to consume the same amount as before, and then there's that increased demand for foreign travel and for transport services.
Okay, thanks. I just want to, we have a hand up as well. Just check on the people to see who's a hand up there for Conor McQuillan.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for taking the question. I mean, can I just ask about the...
I don't know if you can hear us. We should be off mute at this stage. Yeah, thanks, Conor. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to ask about the results in terms of the difference between the expenditure and the output side of the account. So if you look at table 6.1, which breaks down the multinational and non-multinational GVA, I mean, that shows that gross value added grew by 5.7% on the quarter. And obviously GDP grew by 0.3%. So, the difference between GVA and GDP is effectively the statistical discrepancy, which at least in nominal terms hasn't moved much, but maybe implied in real terms has. So, I mean, when we think about this sort of flash estimate that you're producing, I mean, what today's, I think, figures for Q4 show is that there can be extremely large differences between gross value added and the expenditure side of the accounts quarter to quarter. So therefore, how useful can the flash estimate be unless we really start to see a lot more expenditure data brought in to reconcile the two? And I mean, the statistical discrepancy between the output and the expenditure side of the accounts has been, volatile for a very long period of time. If I can maybe just beat Eddie Casey to, his question. I mean, we're talking about the modified domestic demand here, but, we exclude things like aircraft leasing and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, what remains in terms of modified machinery equipment spending can be very lumpy and large. Data centers, etc., may be a play there. So to kind of suggest modified domestic demand has fallen back in Q4 when it could well be a result of what's in, we can see arithmetically it is a result of what's a very lumpy, volatile series when things like employment and consumer spending have expanded. I just wonder, are we in danger of kind of presenting this in a slightly inappropriate fashion that, modified domestic demand as it currently is defined is still very, very volatile quarter to quarter and can give a misleading picture of the trends. But look, my main question there is just on this, the large gap between the output and the expenditure side.
Many thanks, Conor. Chris, do you want to take
the discrepancy bit and the lumpy question about MPD and back to you for the expenditure issue with the T30. So it's a good point about the statistical discrepancy. So it is higher in Q4 and showing the result of the divergence between the two sets, the output and expenditure data. Not out of line with the last 8 quarters of our data. And in fact, for the year now, 2022, the overall discrepancy is very low in the data. So we do have quarter-on-quarter issues, timing issues, which we should have, and the discrepancy should oscillate between the quarters. And for the year overall, it's very small. Which when we come back mid-year with the annual revisions, we'll look at that again. About investment data. So for a firm, typically an investment decision is a once-off decision, and it can happen. It doesn't happen again. But for the economy, it is more of a pattern investment. So we see across, particularly some of the work we've done with gathering data from pharma companies, it's a continued trend on investment into the plant and machinery across numbers of companies. So that, in aggregate, it tends not to be as lumpy, I guess. Like that. But there is a trend there in the M&E investment data. The things that cause the extreme volatility are aircraft and IP. And, clearly we've taken that out in the modified series. So I think I stand back and I look at MDD and I go, look throughout COVID, what did it tell us pre-COVID, during COVID, and now in 2022? It gives us a really good picture of what happened to the economy, the domestic side of the economy, for people to use for policy purposes. Do you want to talk about the expenditure?
I think it's a good point Conal makes, and I think it's something we're going to keep investigating it, and that expenditure side of the account is the piece that we need to get more information on. But I think we will continue to to analyse and to try and get a decent T+30 estimate out.
Okay. Many thanks. I want to go to chat now just to check because there's a couple of questions or a number of questions have come in through the chat. So from Eddie Casey from IFAC, Eddie is asking any more information on the respective contributions of data centres and back to office investment behind the overall changes in machinery and equipment in Q3, Q4. Do we have anything on that?
Can I take that?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so we spent quite a bit of time talking about that for the last number of quarters. I guess it's fallen back a bit this quarter, so I got perhaps less to say about it. We are looking at this firm by firm. There's no one answer on that throughout the last 4 quarters. We were watching the data center expenditure by 1 or 2 firms in each quarter, but the back to office spending has fallen off a little bit. That is a notable feature in Q4, and we're looking at that across lots of firms, I guess. But I think that, there's a clear story in that. It's fallen off the back to office expenditure, and the data center investment tends to be more volatile because it's dependent on 1 or 2 firms. So we let that play out over the next couple of quarters and see where that goes.
Many thanks, Chris. I just follow up. Eddie had another comment and question as well, and I can take this one. And Eddie asked the question about the value of the flash GDP estimate, how useful it is in the context of the Irish economy and I suppose the volatility in the economy, and is there, should we be directing the efforts elsewhere to give into developing estimates of maybe flash estimates of MDD or PCE or domestic GVA. So I'll just start on that one as well. And I'd say it's not a legal requirement to supply the estimates at T+30 to Eurostat, but it is an important part of our participation in the European statistical system and in contribution to the early estimates that are required for policy making at a European level. So it is something we have been developing over time and working on, and see could we get the resources to do some work on these flash estimates. And we can understand when people look at the output that came at the start of the year versus the outturn now. But I do think looking at it, I think even when we came with our 0.3% result today, even in the absence of a flash estimate, I think people would have been asking the questions about it, and we would have been given the same answers on that. So it is something that we are interested in pursuing and feeding into that EU overall aggregate. the EU, the Eurostat press release, I think, will be out next week, and that will be taking in our revised information and any other revisions that are there across other member states as well. And you do see that other member states revise after 2 months the estimate. At 2 months, they'll have revisions on the estimate they put in at T plus 30. So it is a process. I would say also the investigation of the early data that we use as part of the T plus 30 estimation process will always help with the ongoing process of developing quality and improving quality that's there. So we'll continue to do it, but we're not diverting. But I think the good part of that I want to pass on to Brian, that you've asked a very good question as well there, Eddie, is around the possibility of developing early estimates of modified domestic demand, or PCE. So I'll just pass to Brian on that as well, because I know it's something
it's something we've been thinking about, and we are looking at, and we have we have looked at the nowcasting models. I know DSRI and Department of Finance produce nowcasting. It's something we've looked at, and I think it's something we will look at in terms of data as well. And as Jennifer said, having looked at trying to estimate T plus 30, it has kind of given us a chance to review how we do our T plus 60. So there's a lot of good work there and learning. And I think we'll continue to develop it, but I think it will be good to have a domestic indicator at an earlier point as well. So
I think the value is where we can get data. If we can have earlier access to data that we can use to help to develop this work on the early estimates, because we're conscious that it happens right the way across some of the other users and institutions as well. Okay, so just another question that's come into the chat from Killian Carl. Many thanks from Killian. 2 questions on the compensation of employees. Chris, I'll be passing these to you. How is the backdated component of new public sector pay deal treated across the quarters in 2022? And the second question there, very welcome, the constant price compensation of employees. And Killian is just wondering about some more information on how the series is constructed. So if you want to answer, but maybe there's an offline discussion with Killian as well that we could take the opportunity to go into more detail. But if you want to just take initially the public sector pay, the backdating of that, and then maybe a flavour.
I'm not sure if I have that to hand. We have our expert actually sitting right beside us.
Brian, maybe we can take that.
But we are taking the PMOD data in for COE, so it is the amount spent in the quarter. I'm not sure if we wouldn't accrue that back typically. No.
It comes in on the revenue file from revenue, the payroll. So I mean, any pay that's paid will be in the period when it's received by the
cost of employing people in this particular period. The deflator actual hours worked. We didn't spend too much time on that today, but I think we can talk to people afterwards about how that is put together and applied.
Yeah.
The real drive there was to get the COE data onto the same basis as all the other indicators in the accounts. Deflating the income side of the accounts is quite difficult. Deflating profit, deflating wages conceptually is a little bit more difficult. But we're using actual hours worked as a volume of work done to move the wage bill data forward. We can talk to people more maybe about that afterwards. It gets a little bit
Many thanks, Chris. Just to say to Killian, you have to make contact if there's a follow-up or more detail that you'd like to hear about on that work and compensation of employees. Okay. Just wanted to do a final check. Yeah, we have another question in the room here from Robert Short.
Simple question in terms of explaining jump around in numbers in the final quarter. Can we say that the economy has slowed down in the final quarter, or is it more a case that there's volatility in quarterly figures?
I think that the thing that's led us to growth in 22, that investment in equipment has slowed down. So, but when you stand back and look at it, it's still so high in Q4 that it's very hard to say that that's a smaller value, because when you compare it to any other period in the time series outside 2022, it's still bigger. So I think when I look at that set of data, I'd probably go towards the annual result and say that sums it up quite well. That the overall result for the year in modified investment is very strong, and that sums up the year. The fourth quarter just adds a kind of final piece to the picture, I think.
Okay. And I'll check online. Conal, I see Conal's hand is up. I don't know if that's maybe from the previous question. Maybe Conal wants to come. No, okay. So Conal, a follow-up question, but no. Okay. So just to repeat the thanks to the people for attending here in RG Road this morning and for joining us online. And as I say always, if you have any further follow-up questions or any queries on today's results or on any other aspect of the work, or indeed on any other of our outputs, make contact through the contact information that's available on the releases or the press release. Okay, thanks to all.